Meanwhile, at Gotrov's Empress's palace. When the Empress, who was lying down receiving a massage, got up and asked, the maid who delivered the message quickly lowered her head. The maid quickly brought a change of clothes, having sensed the Empress's mood. The maids retreated as the Empress gestured to the one who had brought the news. Then, as she put on the clothes, she asked again. Who is going? The maid said, Kane Knox and Gavilan Ruhan have arrived at the harbor secretly. These two had been the shadowy figures guarding Adele, serving as key members of Gotrov Tower's headquarters and filling the void left by the Crown Princess. The Empress asked, on the Emperor's orders. It appears so, the maid replied. The Empress continued, what else have you found out? The maid replied, it seems that His Majesty the Emperor has sent them a letter, but I couldn't ascertain the contents. I see. You've done well. You may leave. As the maid briskly left the room, the Empress heaved a long sigh. As the maid carefully tied her hair, the Empress spoke. It's obvious at first glance. The Emperor thinks so much of his sister. Isn't it written that she should come back when things get difficult? Quote, yes, Your Majesty. The Empress, lost in thought, muttered softly. Deceptive. Would it make you feel better to pretend you're doing this for the country, leaving your daughter behind? Her eyes grew deep and dark, filled with bitterness. Adele takes after me. We may have differing opinions that have led us to this point, but if that child had shared my sentiments, Adele would have been the most intriguing ally and my strongest support. The thought was heart-wrenching. If Adele had thought like the Empress and become the Emperor of Gotrov, mother and daughter would have shared the world, laughing together. Adele, that child, you see, she's the type who is perfect for the throne, yet simultaneously not suitable at all. Too clear water cannot sustain fish. How many people would give up their lives for their beliefs? How many would understand such individuals? When a typhoon strikes, the reeds may survive, but the trees will bend. That child is the most ideal emperor, and paradoxically, only possible in the realm of ideals. As the palace maid finished arranging the Empress's hair, she took a step back and inquired, what if they bring the Crown Princess to Gotrov? To that question, the Empress smirked and shook her head. That won't happen. The Empress's eyes, which had been vacant as she gazed into the void, gradually reddened, and tears welled up. Before she left, Adele secretly took 2 vials of a potent poison from the Imperial apothecary. The tears falling from her eyes stained her red skirt. Yes, she's a stubborn one, isn't she? That's her way of saying she'll never come back. Adele was a child who wouldn't surrender on days when there was no turning back and chose death instead. A large merchant ship bound for Econt began to glide across the water, carried by the breeze. The blue sea broke into white foam, clearing the path. Standing at the bow was a man with impressively long silver hair and deep green eyes. His name was Kane Knox. His eyes, fixed in the direction of Econt, seemed as deep as the sea. At that moment, a man approached him and gripped the railing, leaning forward. A voice came. Seriously, before you leave, why don't you at least show some emotion and beg not to go? I told you so, didn't I? Kane said, quiet. Well, even if he had done that, would the situation have changed? In reality, countless people had clung to her ankles, begging her not to leave. But how ruthlessly had she shaken them off and gone? Those who followed the nobility inevitably became seeds of rebellion. Even without an inheritance as insignificant as a mouse dropping, it was dangerous, let alone when she had been the heir at one point. Her presence was not tolerable in any way that did not benefit Gotrov. So she left without mercy. Gavilan sighed and said, they might be happy that we're going, who knows? If it's unfortunate, they might even ask us to bring you back. The mischievous expression disappeared completely from his face. He continued, the Emperor expects us to bring her back if she's unhappy. If she were the kind of person who could be persuaded so easily, she wouldn't have left in the first place. If you ask me, there's only one way. We can bring her back to Gotrov. And that if she was dethroned. But just thinking about it makes me angry. If that's the case, I'll turn Econt into a wasteland, I will ruin the Econt. Cain gazed at the horizon beyond the empty sea even after Gavilan went into the cabin. At the end of this journey to Econt, the person they sought was waiting. Cain closed his eyes. Meanwhile in the Empress Palace Econt, the Empress was not feeling well. After the conversation with the Emperor, she wanted to spend some time alone. She called Lady Giggs. "Madam, I'm going for a walk." Adele paused as she stood by the door, and in response to her words, Lady Giggs, the lady-in-waiting, quickly brought her a coat. She was already dressed in anticipation of accompanying the Queen. Adele, slipping into the coat provided, told the lady-in-waiting, "I'll go alone." Lady Giggs spoke. "That's not advisable, Your Majesty. The sun is about to set." Empress Adele replied, "I won't go far. I'll be back before it gets too dark." Adele insisted on going by herself. Giggs, the lady-in-waiting, fell silent. Adele silenced her with a polite smile before slipping out of the palace quickly, avoiding the main entrance to minimize public attention. Giggs watched the Queen as she left, a troubled expression on her face, and her blue eyes betrayed a mix of worry and concern. Oddly enough, the Empress Adele reminded her more of Princess Elizabeth. What had become of Elizabeth? Had she divorced Theodore Balder, the Duke, and eventually been exiled to a remote fiefdom? Giggs stayed up for several nights, her heart aching when she found out the truth. Elizabeth had discovered that the Duke of Despun and the Emperor were scheming to pass a law to strip the princess spouse of political authority. So, Elizabeth boldly initiated her divorce from Theodore Balder and left the capital. Giggs sighed as she watched the receding figure of the Empress. "Perhaps I should prepare some warm water in case she returns for a bath." By the time the sun was setting, the wind had become even sharper. Despite the biting cold, Adele didn't seem to notice. She was walking along the path she had taken earlier in the day with Lionel. It was a desolate area with very few people around, and Adele moved effortlessly, her body acting on autopilot. Her mind was boiling with emotions, yet she pushed all the discomfort away, focusing on walking as her subconscious guided her every step. She paid it no heed and continued walking. Every step she took seemed to make the ground beneath her tremble and give way to her presence, like the world itself was changing in response to her. Her eyes were glued to the ground, and she continued her steps without any clear direction, lost in thought. Then a black shadow crossed her path, interrupting her trance. Her eyes slowly lifted from the ground, and she found herself staring at the figure of a man standing there with the sun at his back. Adele squinted at the sudden, intense light that was now right in front of her. With a step, the shadow cast by the man fell onto her feet. And then another step, and the shadow reached her ankles. Adele couldn't help but pause and once again turn her gaze towards the enigmatic figure. The shadow drew even closer, one step at a time, and then finally, it covered her completely. Submerged within his shadow, Adele whispered his name. "Lionel, Your Majesty, the Empress." He called out, but she didn't seem to hear. His voice was barely above a whisper. He continued, "Are you leaving the palace? Is this the way you're heading? Your Majesty, where are you going at this hour?" She replied, "For a walk." As her forehead reflexively creased, Adele glanced around at the dimming surroundings. She asked, "If you are going this way, why don't we walk together?" Lionel bit his lip as Adele's laughter-tinged voice, her nonchalant tone, and her expression suggested as if nothing had happened. The weary and powerless image from a moment ago had disappeared. The Empress was now desperately struggling to maintain her composure. He then said, "Cain Knox, Gavilan Luhan, and Theodore Cynic." At the sudden mention of these names, Adele swallowed hard. "If you ever wish to speak their names, just let me know. If you need them, feel free to tell me anytime." Lionel spoke earnestly, his black eyes shining. Even though bringing them here wouldn't offer him any advantage, the chilly wind that had been blowing through his heart started to feel warmer. His kindness was like a warm knife, gently slicing through the strong walls and revealing the most delicate parts. His broad stature seemed even sturdier today, and Adele's weakened heart kept urging her to lean against his shoulders. Adele playfully broke the silence. And spoke. "I've chosen my advisor very well, haven't I? With that, she began to walk back the way they had come. Lionel quickly caught up with her, matching her strides. He then asked, "Who are they?" The Empress then spoke, "Those who used to accompany me, breaking into the tower." Lionel continued, "They must be the ones in charge of the tower headquarters. I've heard of the Knox family from Gotrov." The Empress Adele continued, "Really? Well, the Knox family is a highly respected lineage. Cain Knox is their illegitimate son. He's the only precious son, and because he followed me around as if I were his mother, the family often came to me to discuss family matters." Lionel then playfully spoke, "They must have asked to exclude him from the tower headquarters, I assume." Adele suddenly burst into laughter, as if reminiscing about the past. She then said, "Yes, but Cain is as good at breaking into the tower as I am. I scolded him and told him to go talk to your son about that. But even after that, they still came to me for advice more than to my own son. I should have expected that." As they talked about their hometown, the Empress's expression became lighter. Her face would get lost in the darkness, bathed in the setting sun, when she turned her head towards him, and it repeatedly enveloped her in a vibrant red glow. She looked so beautiful that Lionel pretended to ask about Gotrov to see her radiant face, and Adele answered him with a sparkle in her eyes. He hoped this moment would never end. Then Adele suddenly asks, "Where did you get that jacket? That you lent me before, could you ask if they make women's coats too? They seem really warm." Adele suddenly remembered the pleasant scent that had come from his clothes. She asked, "What perfume do you use?" He was stunned. He then spoke, "I don't use perfume." "Really? Are you sure?" This time, Adele widens her eyes. There was no way he did, right? As Adele leaned in and took a deep breath, Lionel reflexively took a step back. His ears were burning, and the two gazes collided in midair. Adele straightened herself, put on a serious expression, and continued walking. "I see." Lionel followed the Empress, and for some reason, he tried to smell his own clothes. It didn't seem like it was him who used perfume. It must be Empress perfume which she smelled on his jacket. As Lionel thought, the two shadows, wrapped in the dreamy red light, walked side by side. In those shadows, they were not the Empress and her advisor, but simply a man and a woman. He wished that this walk would never end. Meanwhile in the Emperor office, Carl, who was busy with his paperwork, opened the door and glanced at Diane when she appeared, but then lowered his gaze to his documents. He asked, "What's the matter? Speak." "I'm going back to the Ivory Palace today." Even with these words, the Emperor merely stared at her with a cold expression. He offered no concerns about the substantial rental fee or any light congratulations. Unable to bear the ensuing silence, Diane placed her hand on her belly and began to speak slowly. "I feel the baby's movements. This child must have a very cheerful personality. Wouldn't it be nice if you came to visit and spoke to the baby from time to time?" Diane scrutinized Carl's face, her gaze sharp. "Children need the love of their biological parents, don't they? Your Highness, I don't have the strength to protect this child. Would you acknowledge this child? Both me and your Majesty's child." At this point the Emperor was pissed off from her nagging and he shouted, "Enough." She cried, "Don't abandon me and this child, Your Highness." Carl, who had been muttering, suddenly stood up and approached her with quick strides. Diane, who had always been thought of as weak, didn't back down and faced him. Carl came close to her, bringing his face inches from hers, and growled softly. He spoke, "I always told you not to talk about that. I told you that my love was enough." Terrified, Diane shot back, "Have you shown me love recently? Where were you when I was chased out of the Ivory Palace? Have you ever come to find me during my time here?" Tears slowly fell from Diane's eyes. She hadn't come with the intention of crying and clinging to him, but as she spoke, her emotions overflowed. "Why are you suddenly treating me like this?" Diane grabbed Carl's arms and buried her face in his chest. But then Carl slowly pushed her shoulders back. With a surprised expression, Diane looked up at Carl. He stared at her with an affectionless or even pitying gaze, then looked down at his own clothes. His jacket was stained with her tears. He confirmed this and unbuttoned his jacket. Then in an angry tone he spoke, "Get out." Diane's hand trembled like a leaf. The chilly feeling that started in her chest passed through her abdomen in an instant. When she urgently turned to leave his office, it happened. Just as she left his office, a woman elegantly entered as if she were a new document maid. She smoothly passed through the office door. After a while Lennox came to Ivory Palace to meet Diane. He was happy that now she is back to the Ivory Palace. He asks, "How are you feeling, and do you know how much money Duke spent to rent this Ivory Palace just for you?" Diane wasn't pleased by this. She then spoke, "Don't think highly of Duke Despun, he was just using us, then the moment he felt like he could discard us, he would discard us again. He is a cunning man, brother." But Lennox takes Duke's side. He spoke, "You have been ungrateful, Diane. If Duke Despun gave us shelter we might be living on streets." She was so done with his childish behavior. She thought how foolish her brother can be. "Why did you summon me?" Lennox asked. Diane spoke. She saw a new servant at the Emperor office, blue eyes and blonde hair. "Take care of her as soon as possible, we need to give other people lessons." He wasn't surprised and agreed to take care. After a while, Diane, taking a deep breath, exhaled heavily before speaking, seized the opportunity to kill the Empress. "What?" Lennox exclaimed. "Keep it down. Lower your voice," Diane cautioned. "Kill the Empress," Lennox repeated. Meanwhile, at that time, in Vueta, preparations were underway. Fortunately, no slums had formed here, but every house was bustling with relatives seeking refuge. A child who had become the seeker in a game of hide-and-seek shouted loudly, "All right, I'm coming to find you." Then turned around dramatically. As they playfully laughed and headed in the direction of a cart where they suspected a friend might be hiding, there was a sudden crash. A black spot began to appear in the center of the crimson sky. Vueta opened his eyes again, looking up at the impending disaster. He had always been aware that avoiding the calamity had merely been a matter of luck. He turned his body after identifying the location where the tower was falling and gave quick orders. "Evacuate all the villages in the southern region and open the castle gate. Prepare for the arrival of the mausoleums pouring out from the castle gate." "Yes, Your Grace." "You, raise the signal fires right now and activate the defense formation of the southern district. Request reinforcements from the capital." "Yes, Your Grace. We will pray for help to arrive from the capital, and endure as long as we can." As he recalled the impending destruction that had been foretold by Count Calvin, who had not received support from the magicians, Vueta's heart raced with unease. Nobody knew whether Vueta would share the same fate or if he could be saved. Only the Emperor and Duke Despoin would know. "Please." Vueta's desperate murmur was drowned out by the screams that erupted from all around. The residents of Vueta's domain gazed up at the reddening sky, appearing helpless in the face of the overwhelming calamity. The next day, Duke Despun personally sought out Adele. Brazenly, wearing a pitiful expression, he asked, "Empress, how great are your concerns?" Look at his audacity. While inwardly thinking so, the Empress also tilted her head with a bittersweet expression. "Thank you for your concern." Both the expression and the voice feels like acting. Duke Despun also scrutinized the Empress with eyes full of suspicion. When their sharp and keen gazes met, both the Empress and the Duke subtly averted their eyes. The two remained silent for a moment, smoothing out their expressions. Adele was the first to say, "I'm fine, so please don't worry too much." After Adele, who had visited the Magicians' Guild the last time, left, Duke Despun wrestled with his thoughts. Should he publicly acknowledge the Empress as a magician and allow her to attend the Central Council meeting? He could acknowledge her easily. In fact, it was strange not to acknowledge her, considering everyone knew that the Empress had single-handedly destroyed the tower. However, the problem was her attendance at the Central Council meeting. He thought, no, absolutely not. On the surface, he pretended otherwise, but the more he thought about it, the more it didn't seem like a normal situation. If he foolishly let her attend the meeting and she uttered nonsense, it would be difficult to rectify. I must not entrust her with the task of removing the tower. If, by any chance, the Empress took control of the situation, would the Balder brothers not insist that she attend the Central Council meeting as well? While the Duke was pondering intensely, Adele read the Duke's expression with sharp eyes. It seemed that the Duke had made up his mind, perhaps prompted by Diane's pregnancy. Assisting in the discreet leasing of the Ivory Palace was likely part of his efforts. Adele pretended not to know and continued the match. When is the next Central Council meeting? Ah, before that, I need to be certified, right? When and where should I go? I'm fine to go right away, the Empress said. The Duke pretends to be greatly considerate and claims that he would certify her without any tests. He didn't forget to mention that it was possible due to my unprecedented concern for the Empress's convenience. Adele couldn't help but touch her forehead at his performance. She thought at least, just try saying you can't attend the Central Council meeting. Pretend to faint or something to silence her. Anything to keep her from talking. As the Duke took a deep breath to broach the main topic, there was a hurried knock on the door. Both of them turned their attention to the door simultaneously. As it cautiously opened, Lady Giggs and an armed knight entered one after another. What's going on? The serious expressions on Adele's and the Duke's faces deepened at the unsettling atmosphere. The knight approached, his face stern, and spoke. There's news that the tower has descended at the Marquis Vuetta. The Marquis Vuetta? As Duke Despun urgently inquired, the knight nodded. Yes, that's correct. As the words fell, the Duke abruptly rose from his seat. Oh no, Empress. I must personally go there. Excuse me. Adele narrowed her eyes. While the county of Calvin was left unattended, what criteria dictated an immediate visit to the Marquis Vuetta? The Duke hastily grabbed his outer garment and questioned the knight as if interrogating him. You must have contacted the Magician's Guild and the Knight's Order, right? Let's go quickly, it's urgent. The knight said, I'm sorry, but before that, I must deliver an order. The Duke, with widened eyes and irritation, asked, What? What order? As the knight was about to open his mouth, the Empress intervened. An order to participate, I presume. What? Participate? Startled, Duke Despun exclaimed, What's going on? When the knight looked at him, he quickly nodded. Yes, that's correct. The Duke, abandoning the outer garment he had picked up, vehemently waved his hand. No, our Empress to participate in such a danger. No way. I'm fine, Adele reassured. No, it's not allowed. Absolutely not. Duke spoke. It's fine. Why would it be troublesome if I went? Adele asked. Duke opened his mouth and spoke. Not exactly, but I'm just concerned for Empress. It's a hellish place. So please, don't worry. The Empress and the Duke stared at each other as if they were trying to outwit each other. Eventually, the Duke swallowed his boiling frustration and turned away. Is wearing a crown on your head becoming a habit, Karl Ulrich? Rather than putting a leash on a wild animal, you dare to open our doors. As the Duke angrily left the reception room. Later, the army that received the order to mobilize quickly gathered. In order to remove the massive tower ranging from level 2 to level 1, the Imperial Knights 1st and 2nd Divisions, Strikers 1st Division, and Keepers 1st Division were all mobilized. It was nothing less than an assembly of the elite. This was in stark contrast to Count Calvin's request to bring even one keeper, which was promptly rejected. Despite the chaos of the knights and mages preparing for deployment, they continued to glance somewhere. Empress, please reconsider. Duke Despun, dressed in a robe, confronted the Empress. He tried to persuade her by presenting various excuses to prevent her participation. It's difficult to find separate accommodations on the way. Have you ever tried homelessness? Well, there, can you see the luggage I've packed? Adele pointed behind her without any courtesy. Duke continued, you won't have the luxury to cook separately throughout the journey. Have you ever tried eating rations? Do you know how hard they are on the teeth? The Empress smirked and said, I have healthy teeth. I enjoy eating tough things. Don't expect a carriage. Duke said, I prefer horseback riding. After all, Didn't I grow up in Gotrov? As the Duke, unable to find a retort, was left speechless, entered his arguments. An awkward silence enveloped the room. As the Empress approached, Lionel, who had been observing the skirmish with the Duke, asked in a hushed tone, "Are you sure you'll be okay, running non-stop like this?" "I've done it before, remember." "I'll be fine," Adele replied casually. "How can it be fine?" Lady Giggs interjected sharply as she brought Adele's luggage. Worry and concern clung to the stern face of the meticulous lady. It was disconcerting for her to go directly to where danger lurked, and the tight schedule for the forced march added to the concern. But look at that stubborn expression. Blocking the Empress's departure seemed impossible. Absolutely do not skip meals. When you sleep, make sure to have something weapon-like with you. Don't go anywhere alone, no matter how curious you are. Surprisingly, the Empress listened quietly to the lady's nagging, nodding along at appropriate intervals. Understood. Don't worry, I'll be careful, got it. Suddenly, to everyone's amazement, the lady's nagging rapidly decreased and soon vanished. Please be careful. At that moment, the long horn announcing the departure resounded. Adele lightly patted Lady Giggs on the shoulder, effortlessly mounted the horse without a stirrup, and somehow, she was someone who cared about Adele. The knights and mages who had finished their preparations headed resolutely to their positions. Lionel led the group of knights, and Adele stood side by side with Duke Despun. "Empress, we will definitely eliminate the tower of Viscount Vuetta and return." The Duke Despun roared towards the tower above the castle gate. The Emperor stood on the tower and looked down below. The Empress, seated on a majestic warhorse, gazed ahead calmly. Before the Archduke had visited the Emperor for a talk. "Your Majesty, why did you order the Empress to march without a single word of consultation? What if the Empress decides to rebel?" "Ye Emperor smirked and spoke, then make sure she doesn't rebel. Why send both Lennox Poiters and the Duke to battle at the same time?" Despite Duke Despun rushing towards the castle gate like a raging fire, the Emperor did not retract his orders. There was only one thing he desired. As the Emperor slowly raised his right hand with an arrogant expression, the massive gate slowly opened. The Emperor muttered, "Go and feel it in your bones, Adelaide. Realize that the only comfortable place for you is by my side." When the two straight gates were fully open, the soldiers on the castle walls began ringing bells. As if anticipating the charge, the warhorses snorted, and the soldiers kicked their heels. When all the gates were open, Lionel leapt forward first, followed by other horses. The armed forces swiftly traversed the capital. After bidding farewell to the Empress and returning to the palace, Lady Giggs took a deep breath to compose herself. Despite experiencing numerous events while guarding the palace, this was the first time the Empress herself had personally gone into battle. It was during the time when Giggs, suppressing her anxious heart, was tidying up the Empress's room. "Lady, Miss Portiers, has come to visit." Lady Giggs hesitated at the maid's words. However, she quickly straightened her shoulders, as if to say, "When has it ever been different?" and opened her eyes wide. "Does she wish to see me?" The maid, with eyes like a pristine snowy plain, dared not meet Giggs' gaze and quickly replied, "Yes." Currently, Lady Giggs' status within the palace was that of a guest. While most people in the palace treated her as the general manager, it was merely a formality. Staying in the palace as a guest was the same for Diane. However, considering the situation where rumors of Diane being pregnant with the Emperor's child were spreading quietly, was it wise to refuse her meeting request? After organizing her thoughts, Lady Giggs walked gracefully toward the door and asked the maid, "Where is she?" Diane stared intently at the servant placing a teacup in front of her. The cup trembled as the maid's hand shook. Diane, looking down at the seemingly overflowing yet delicate tea, tilted her head and whispered, "Long time no see. How have you been?" The maid trembled in fear and spoke, "Lady of the palace." Diane continued, "Did it seem deserted after I took over the Ivory Palace?" No, not at all." The contemplative maid bowed her head, seemingly repenting. Diane, with a fierce gaze, also glanced at other maids who were waiting nearby. Like frightened rabbits, the maids lowered their heads. The change in the attitude of the servants was the first thing that had changed after seizing the ivory palace. Those who initially served Diane, providing money and even strength among the maids, were the ones she favored. Diane, who had been gently caressing the cheek of a maid with a bowed head, suddenly gripped her chin tightly. Once a dog bites its master, it can't do it twice. There's no need for an apology. Just don't let yourself be seen by me again. At that moment, a knocking sound echoed. Diane, with a sharp gaze, released the maid's chin as if flicking away a stray hair. The cowering maid hastily got up and stepped back. As the door opened, yet she didn't rise from her seat even when Lady Giggs entered. With a disdainful gaze that showed no sign of acknowledgement, Diane tilted the teacup. The bittersweet tea felt sweet as she thought of the baby in her belly. Diane smiled with a twinkle in her eyes. Unperturbed, Lady Giggs opened her mouth with utmost elegance. "Do you have any business, Miss Portiers?" It would be awkward to completely ignore the meeting, but there was no need to treat her as an honored guest either. Diane smirked, setting down the teacup she had been holding and leaned back on the sofa. With an attitude befitting the owner of the palace, Lady Giggs glared at Diane sternly. Diane tilted her head towards Lady Giggs, gently placing her hand on her own belly as if to show off. "I'd like to have a private conversation with the lady. Could you clear the surroundings?" "It's fine if they stay, but it's for the lady's sake." Although she didn't have the status of the palace manager, Lady Giggs was overseeing the servants in the Empress's palace. Lady Giggs ordered the maids around. "Everyone, leave." The maids promptly fled as if they had been waiting for that command. Diane, with a mischievous smile, poured tea into Lady Giggs's cup. "Please, have a seat. If you have something to say, please do." Lady Giggs stood tall, observing Diane with a strict expression. Diane smirked, placing the tea kettle on the table and chuckling. Then, she approached Lady Giggs. On the day Diane returned to the Ivory Palace, she had been sitting at her desk, waiting for this moment. "Madame Beatrice died at 29. I'm different from that person. I wanted to tell you that." Diane, caressing her belly, laughed exuberantly. "With our little one on the way, do you think I'll die at 29? In Diane's laughter-infused voice, there was a thick attachment and desire sticking closely. Taking another step towards Lady Giggs, Diane whispered confidentially. "I won't end up pitifully dying like Madame Beatrice, losing a child to the Empress. I will be recognized as the mother of my child, and then..." Pausing for a moment, Diane gazed silently at Lady Giggs. In her now expressionless face, there was the venom characteristic of those who survived in the palace. "I will definitely kick you out of the palace. Definitely, never to see her again with those disdainful blue eyes." Lady Giggs looked at Diane with a reluctant gaze. If Diane was indeed pregnant, it wouldn't be wise to provoke her now. Lady Giggs might find herself in a difficult situation if Diane were to suddenly collapse in pain or anything. "Very well, I have much to attend to. I shall take my leave. Please, take care." As Lady Giggs gracefully turned away and left, Diane, with a mocking expression, glared at the door for a moment. Then, she caressed her belly and whispered, "It must be a son." As if understanding, the baby in her belly seemed to tap her palm lightly. Diane looked down at her belly with eyes mixed with desire and affection, laughing. Viscount Vuetta's territory was not far from the capital. A skilled rider could cover the distance in 2 days. The knights and mages relentlessly spurred their horses to reach the Viscount's territory as quickly as possible. By the time they could set foot on the ground, the sun was setting, and the group hastily prepared for the night. Throughout the journey, Lionel had been watching over Adele constantly. Contrary to the expectations of those who couldn't hide their worries, the Empress rode at the forefront without showing any signs of fatigue. Even the knights were awestruck by her adept equestrian skills. Lionel took Adele's reins and instructed the nearby knights. "Build a temporary residence for Her Majesty the Empress." "Yes, Commander." After confirming that Adele had checked the temporary residence herself and entered, Lionel sighed as he watched the entire group. The sorcerers, now transformed into night guards, each entered their assigned temporary residences, and the knights, with relatively strong stamina, remained vigilant around. Lionel gave a few instructions to Henri. Strengthen the security around Her Majesty the Empress's temporary residence, and check on her if there is anything she needs. Henri faintly smiled and nodded. Do not worry. As the night deepened, a soldier sneaked out of the temporary residence, quietly moving towards a nearby tent. The destination was a nearby tent where Lennox was sitting on a blanket. He rose to his feet, startled, as the soldier entered. Why are you so late? Lennox asked. The soldier, a messenger Lennox had hired a while ago to keep an eye on the movements of the knights, had proven useless until today. However, tonight he was invaluable. I apologize. I found a loophole in the guard. The soldier stammered out his excuse, and Renox shook his head, seemingly weary. That's enough. What did you find? While Lennox's sister's commanding voice echoed in his mind, the soldier handed him a piece of paper. I want the Empress dead. Lennox muttered to himself, recalling Diane Poitier's voice vividly. She wants the Empress dead. Despite finding Diane Poitier detestable on many occasions, Lennox and she had sailed on the same ship. More than anything, Lennox needed Diane's child. Once the baby is born, the Emperor will undoubtedly give my child to the Empress. No doubt about it. The echo of Diane's voice resurfaced. Although the soldier asked in confusion, Lennox paid him no mind, producing a small piece of paper from his pocket and handing it to the soldier. Lennox spoke, head southwest from here, and you'll reach Lewin Viscount. If you're fast, you should arrive by dawn. Once you get there, find him immediately. As the soldier took the paper, Lennox added another sealed envelope. Hand this over as well. You must reach the location I've written by midnight tomorrow, even if it's the last thing you do. Midnight tomorrow, the soldier asked. Yes. Leave now. Lennox shoved a heavy purse into the soldier's chest, and the soldier, bowing deeply, silently slipped out of Lennox's tent. Lennox, now alone, chuckled lazily on the blanket. Opportunity came sooner than expected. Thanks to Diane Poitier and her excellent aura. When you arrive in Vueta, my not-so-beloved Empress, who despises you endlessly, will gracefully die. Plus, all the blame will fall on Lionel Balder, making it all so perfect. Meanwhile, at the Grand Estate, a woman with glamorous golden hair stood on the castle terrace. She was Elizabeth Ulrich Grand, the Duchess of Grand, and the half-sister of the Emperor. Elizabeth squinted her eyes sharply as she observed the influx of refugees. The crisis caused by famine seemed almost trivial, considering the immediate struggle for survival. Morality, norms, and ethics meant less than a piece of bread lying on the ground to those who couldn't resolve the issue of eating and living. In the face of hunger, fists took precedence over laws. In an attempt to address this chaos, Elizabeth's efforts attracted even more refugees. Her estate, not far from the capital, led even residents of the city slums to seek refuge. Her estate was now saturated with refugees, and with no more funds to provide aid, Elizabeth clenched her fists tightly. The herald, who had conveyed messages under her blazing anger, stepped back 2 paces. Those damn bastards! Elizabeth spat out curses vehemently, expressing her volcanic rage. The Duchy of Despun, the only thing on that mad author's mind, had no place in this country. The throne, he didn't want it, finding it bothersome. The weight of the throne, monitored day in and day out with immense responsibilities, was something he didn't want to bear. Yet, the one desiring power akin to the Emperor was this selfish and desire-filled individual. How selfish and childish were his desires. When Elizabeth heard the news of his infertility, she genuinely rejoiced. She was worried about producing a monster like him, but it turned out to be a stroke of luck. But the one playing the role of that damn author was none other than the Emperor himself. The wind carried the scent of autumn, mixing with the smoke, and furrowed Elizabeth's brow. Refugees lit fires throughout the grand forest to escape the cold. The once beautiful forest now bears black scars from several incidents of fire. However, Elizabeth couldn't punish them. It wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. She spoke. I will go to the capital. During my absence, I will entrust the affairs of the estate to Nebern. Be aware of that. I will depart soon, so prepare yourself. Several letters had already arrived from Lady Giggs, and it seemed she was deeply infatuated with the newly arrived Empress. The Empress is a sorceress. Not only was she a formidable individual capable of destroying a tower on her own, but she also demonstrated the ability to squeeze gold bars for Count Calvin. It seemed necessary to meet her. The day after leaving the capital, the expeditionary force, which had set out as soon as dawn broke, moved at a terrifying speed, allowing them to set foot on the ground only as the sun was setting, much like the previous day. However, unlike yesterday, when they struggled as novices, the sorcerers now seemed to be overflowing with vitality. This was because they had entered the magical radius of the tower. The magical radius refers to the range affected by the magic emitted from the tower. The higher the tower, the broader the range of influence, but ultimately, the utilization of that magic depended on the sorcerer's ability. The sorcerers floated in the sea of magic like fish encountering water. Their bodies felt light as if gravity had disappeared, and even small movements attracted magic to them like a magnet. Ah, how long has it been since I tasted magic like this? That's right. It feels like being reborn. Watching the two sorcerers who whispered to each other and moved away. Adele turned her gaze away with a bitter expression. The sense of liberation she felt as a sorcerer sometimes approached her as a feeling of guilt. This was because the magical radius coincided with the activity radius of the magical beast, something that could only exist with magic. A voice was heard from outside. Your Majesty, Lionel Balder, may I enter for a moment? He entered and asked, is there anything uncomfortable? Adele smiled as if satisfied, looking around, and spoke, it's as comfortable as the Empress's palace, so don't worry. Lionel stepped back with a gentle smile at her jest. In the deep, quiet night where even the crickets ceased their cries, Adele, who was immersed in the sweet embrace of deep sleep, suddenly opened her eyes. Fumbling in the darkness with a blurry gaze that blurred the boundaries between dream and reality for a while, Adele slowly regained her senses and tried to sit up. However, something bound her limbs, making it impossible to move an inch. Scissors. No, it was different from the feeling of scissors. A sense of danger surged from the artificial pressure. Adele, who had been struggling to get up somehow, completely gave up and thought. Magic was intricately pressing on her body. If someone could manipulate magic so freely, they wouldn't be an ordinary wizard. Adele pondered hard about who might possess such skill within the Sorcerer's Guild. What does someone want after binding me? Adele sensitively focused her attention and listened carefully. After a while, cautious footsteps were heard, and then she felt someone slowly opening the door of her tent. Soon after, a sharp and crisp sound cut through the silent air carefully. It was undoubtedly the sound of drawing a sword. Adele immediately raised her magic. The opponent's magic, which had been pressing on her, confronted her magic as if in a brief struggle, but soon, it gradually retreated against her power and disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, like a cat burglar, the intruder, who had sneaked into the Empress's tent, rushed at her in an instant, brandishing a dagger. You shouldn't have. Despite the would-be assassins being startled by the Empress's voice, who had said she wouldn't scream, he quickly recovered and forcefully thrust the dagger toward the Empress's throat. However, I said you shouldn't have, didn't I? At that moment, the assassin realized he had taken on a mission he shouldn't have, enticed by the promise of a large sum of money. Before magic paralyzed even his face, he bit down hard on the poison pouch he had been holding in his mouth. When Adele, who had belatedly realized this fact, opened his mouth with her hands, the poison had already spread throughout his body. Oh no, Adele sighed, taking a step back from the convulsing assassin. Shortly after, the assassin's body slackened. Undoubtedly, there was an accomplice among the accompanying sorcerers. Moreover, it was a top-tier sorcerer who could intricately control magic to the extent of binding an unseen opponent's limbs. Even within the Royal Sorcerers Guild, such a skilled individual could be counted on one hand. Despite that, daringly committing such an act, they must have been confident they could kill me. She meticulously observed her surroundings and quietly entered Lionel's tent. A faint lamp flickered briefly, casting a dim light inside the tent. It was regrettable to wake him from his sleep, but Lionel was the only person she could seek help from at this moment. Lionel had neatly covered himself with a blanket, lying straight and sound asleep. He even sleeps properly. Adele, gazing at his meticulously sculpted face, reached out to shake him awake. However, the moment her hand touched his shoulder, an unexpected event occurred. In an instant, Adele's world was turned upside down. Lionel's eyes widened. He muttered, "Her Majesty." He can't believe she was there in such vulnerable position. He thought he might be dreaming. Her nose. Her beautiful face. This must be dream, this can't be real. If this is the dream, then can I? He thought to kiss the Empress and check it by himself. Lionel can't believe it, so he thought to kiss the Empress Adele. He leaned on, and when he was about to kiss her, she screams his name, Lionel, and he gets back to his senses. He finally realized it's not a dream, she was really in his bed. He asks, "What are you doing, Your Majesty, here? At this hour?" She hesitated a bit, but then first she apologized. Sorry Lionel for sneaking in your tent. But first can you let me go?" He didn't realize that he was still holding her. He realized her and was ashamed of what he did. But Adele had no problem, because after all she came unannounced. Lionel asked, "Did something happen? Why Her Majesty is here at this hour?" She told him that they tried to assassinate her. Both of them went back to the Empress Adele tent to see the dead body of that assassin. But surprisingly the body disappeared into thin air. But the blood spot was left there. Lionel muttered, "It seems like someone tried to erase the evidence by removing the body." She told him that whoever was that, they used powerful magic to bound her. It's not a normal magician work. Lionel spoke, "They are so reckless that they tried to murder the Empress of the nation. Probably they already knew, there means they will be discarded if they fail." The Empress Adele's face turned gloomy. She did nothing wrong, yet someone tried to kill her. She spoke, "That person was sure that he could kill me easily." Lionel knew how the Empress is feeling right now. He broke the silence in the room and spoke. "The only powerful magicians in the nation who are capable of assassinating the Empress is the Duc d'Espagne and Lennox Poitiers. But I know the Duke, he will never do something so reckless. And Duke is currently focusing on destroying the Vita Tower. So in my conclusion, this could be done by Lennox Poitiers. So now the body is gone, it's hard to investigate him." Then suddenly Lionel bowed down. The Empress Adele was shocked at what he was doing. He bowed and spoke, "Your Majesty the Empress, I apologize for failing to protect you. It's all my fault." The Empress asked him to rise, and spoke, "It's not your fault." Lionel was disappointed that he knew who was the culprit behind this, but still he can't do anything without the proper evidence. He continued, "Even if we can't reveal that Lennox is behind this, I will let everyone know that there was an assassination attempt. Then they wouldn't be so reckless and will not try to do this again." Empress spoke, "If you reveal this, then everyone will try to blame you. They will hold you responsible and say you didn't protect me proper." But Lionel didn't care about his reputation. He spoke, "Your Majesty's safety is my top priority." She continued, "No need to tell this anyone. Moreover, now that they failed, they wouldn't be able to move carelessly. And I came running to you because I didn't know what to do with the body. But I've only given them a chance to get rid of the evidence. Go and rest, Lionel." But Lionel wasn't happy about this, so he insisted to stay back and protect her. So he went outside for her security. Empress Adele thought, what if she didn't called his name at time? What would have happened? His face was so majestic, and eyes was like he was looking at someone who he loves so deeply. Somehow it felt a little warmer. It's been so long I have felt any shot of warmness, and someone wants to protect me. This feeling, what should I do? Thank you for tuning in to watch this season unfold. Your support means the world to us. We're excited to continue the journey with you in the next story. Until then, take care and stay tuned for what's to come.